It was the kind of morning where the fog seemed reluctant to lift, clinging to the trees like it had nowhere else to be. Jonathan sat on the edge of his porch, a chipped ceramic mug warming his weathered hands, steam curling upward and fading into the silence. For years, this had been his ritual. Rise early, watch the world wake slowly, and wait for the sound that no longer came, the soft, rhythmic tapping of Max's nails on the wooden planks. Max had been more than a dog. He was a constant in Jonathan's otherwise solitary life. A rescue mutt with one floppy ear and a coat the color of cinnamon toast, Max had come into Jonathan's world during a time of deep fracture. Jonathan's wife Mara had passed 3 winters prior after a prolonged battle with pancreatic cancer, and his only daughter lived halfway across the country, calling on birthdays and holidays with updates from a life that seemed to grow further and further from his own. The day Jonathan met Max, the local shelter was overrun. A flood had displaced dozens of pets, and Max, they said, had been found clinging to a broken fence, soaked to the bone, but miraculously unhurt. Jonathan hadn't planned on bringing a dog home. He'd gone in to drop off a donation. But there was something in Max's eyes, a stillness, a sorrow, a strange familiarity that pulled at him like a thread. From the first night Max slept by Jonathan's bed, his breathing a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the old wall clock. He followed Jonathan everywhere, from the hardware store to the fishing dock, always just behind, his presence as steady and quiet as a shadow. And Jonathan, who had once thought his life was winding down, found a strange new rhythm in their companionship. Meals were shared, walks were long and often wordless, and the world, while still filled with absence, felt less empty. Max had quirks that made Jonathan laugh in spite of himself. He was terrified of umbrellas and loved eating ice cubes. He'd chase his tail when excited, and when Jonathan read aloud, something Mara used to love, Max would tilt his head and listen, as though absorbing every word. Years passed, measured not in holidays or birthdays, but in the length of Max's coat, the slowness of his stride, the gray creeping into his muzzle like frost on morning grass. Jonathan began to notice the signs, the stiffness when Max tried to stand, the increasing time it took him to climb the stairs, the faint tremble in his legs after a walk. He told himself it was just age, that Max, like him, was just getting older. Then came the diagnosis, degenerative myelopathy. There was no cure, only management, comfort, love. Jonathan read everything he could, joined forums, changed Max's diet, built ramps to replace steps. For a time, Max seemed to rally, but the decline, though slow, was inevitable. One afternoon, as golden leaves fell like embers from the trees, Max collapsed in the yard. He had been chasing a squirrel with the same half-hearted enthusiasm he showed lately, and suddenly, his back legs just gave out. Jonathan ran to him, cradled his head, whispered, "It's okay, buddy, it's okay," even though nothing felt okay at all. The vet gave him the talk. The one about dignity, and quality of life, and knowing when to let go. Jonathan nodded, understanding all the words, but feeling like he'd entered a foreign country where everything was upside down. He took Max home. They had one last week. 7 days of slow walks to the edge of the property, of spoon-feeding chicken and rice, of lying side by side on the rug, listening to the old radio that crackled out jazz standards like ghosts from the past. Jonathan spoke aloud stories he hadn't told anyone in years, about Mara, about his daughter as a child, about dreams he used to have. Max listened, his eyes alert, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of Jonathan's voice. The last morning was quiet. Max didn't rise. He lifted his head briefly when Jonathan entered the room, thumped his tail once against the floor, and let out a breath that seemed longer than usual. Jonathan lay beside him, pressed his forehead to Max's, and whispered the words he'd rehearsed, but never believed he'd say, "It's okay. You can rest now. Thank you." The vet came to the house. The process was gentle, peaceful. Max's breathing slowed, then stopped as the last light of day filtered through the curtains. Jonathan didn't cry until after, until the silence became unbearable. He buried Max beneath the big oak tree at the back of the property, the one Mara had always loved. He placed beside him a worn tennis ball, a piece of his favorite blanket, and a note that simply read, "My best friend." In the weeks that followed, the world felt hollow. Jonathan still rose early, still sat on the porch with his coffee, still waited for the sound of footsteps that no longer came. He couldn't bring himself to remove Max's leash from its hook, or wash the paw-printed blanket still bunched on the living room floor. He started walking the trails alone. At first, the silence was too much, but slowly he began to notice things again. The call of the morning doves, the rustle of deer in the underbrush, the way the sun filtered through the pines in slanted golden beams. He brought a sketch pad with him, started drawing again, trying to capture the texture of leaves, the curve of branches. Then, one stormy afternoon, there was a knock at the door. A young woman stood there, soaked from the rain, holding a trembling puppy in her arms. "I'm sorry," she said, breathless. "I found him on the road. I saw your light on. I didn't know where else to go." Jonathan looked at the pup. All oversized paws and wide, uncertain eyes. He saw fear, hope, a familiar flicker of something both fragile and enduring. He stepped aside. "You came to the right place," he said. Months passed. The seasons turned. The pup, whom Jonathan named Echo, grew quickly. He was not like Max. He was wild, chaotic, full of boundless energy. He chewed everything, barked at shadows, and had a penchant for stealing Jonathan's socks. But at night, when the house was quiet, he would curl at Jonathan's feet in the exact same spot Max used to favor, and Jonathan felt not a replacement, but a continuation. On some mornings, just as the fog began to lift, Echo would trot across the porch, and the soft tapping of his paws on the wood would echo through the stillness. Jonathan smiled more. He joined a local dog club. He built a small agility course in the yard. Echo learned quickly: sit, stay, roll over, and more. He learned to sense when Jonathan was sinking into a memory, and would nuzzle close, grounding him. One night, as snow fell thick and quiet, Jonathan took Echo to the edge of the oak grove. He stood in front of Max's grave, brushing the snow from the headstone. "I miss him," he said softly, "but I'm glad you're here." Echo pressed against his leg. Jonathan reached down, ruffling his fur. As they turned back, he glanced up. In the trees, a barn owl took flight, silent, watchful. The world didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of echoes, of love, of memory. And Max's footsteps, though silent, would always guide him home.